Imagine walking into a cozy, rustic cafe. The servers are friendly, the food is fresh and homemade, and the atmosphere feels like an escape from the fast-paced world. But behind this charming exterior lies a disturbing reality. Today we're exploring the hidden world of the 12 tribes, a cult that started in the 1970s and has been operating in plain sight ever since. So, what are they hiding? And why did so many people join them, only to get trapped inside? Today, we try to answer that question. It's time to take a deep breath and let the fresh air in. Hi everyone, welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post a couple videos every single week on one of these topics, so if this is something that interests you, please consider subscribing to the channel. I would love to have you here. We're going to jump right in today. So let's go back to the early 1970s. The United States was in turmoil, reeling from the trauma of the Vietnam War and the disillusionment it caused among the American people. The civil rights movement had transformed the social landscape, and society was facing a wave of distrust towards the government, mainstream religion, and traditional institutions. It was a time when people were actively looking for new ways to find purpose and meaning in life. The counterculture movement of the 1960s, marked by free love, peace protests, and spiritual seeking, had paved the way for many young people to break from traditional norms and explore alternative lifestyles. This environment was the perfect breeding ground for new religious and spiritual movements, especially those that claimed to offer a pure, untainted path to enlightenment or salvation. It was during this time that Albert Eugene Spriggs, later known as Yonek, saw an opportunity to create something unique. Spriggs was a former high school guidance counselor from Tennessee, with a complicated past that included a brief stint in the Marines and a deep-seated desire to find his own spiritual path. So he was raised in a Christian household. But by the time he reached adulthood, he had become disillusioned with mainstream Christian churches because he saw them as hypocritical and hollow. He viewed them as morally corrupt institutions who were more focused on wealth and status than on genuine spirituality. This dissatisfaction led him to experiment with different religions, practices, and eventually he came up with his own mishmash hybrid teachings, blending Christianity with elements of Judaism and personal doctrines that he invented. Spriggs believed that he could create a purer, unquote, what a weird word. He wanted to create a more pure community, untainted by the influence of a corrupt world. Spriggs first put his beliefs into action in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a city historically rooted in conservative values and traditional Christianity. Here, he began hosting small Bible study groups where he attracted people with his unique teachings. His interpretation of the scripture was strict, and he combined Old and New Testament teachings with concepts of communal living and absolute obedience to spiritual authority, starting, of course, with Spriggs himself. Spriggs's charisma played a significant role in his early success. He was intense, persuasive, and deeply committed to his message. This commitment made his beliefs incredibly compelling, especially to young people who were just kind of bored with mainstream life and searching for something more meaningful. Spriggs preached about the value of abandoning worldly desires to create a close-knit, godly community. He spoke about his group as the 12 Tribes of Israel Reborn, a concept that gave his followers a sense of identity and purpose and feeling like they were special. His teachings, combined with those Christian beliefs and Jewish customs like keeping the Sabbath, following dietary restrictions, and adhering to strict codes of behavior, and these codes of behavior extended to every aspect of everyday life. He wrote doctrines that he claimed would bring his followers closer to God, unburdened by the materialistic and morally bankrupt world they were leaving behind. Spriggs's message especially resonated with those young people who were searching for a lifestyle with some structure but also purpose in an era that was marked by upheaval and spiritual searching. So it didn't take long for Spriggs's small Bible study to grow into a full-blown community. Young men and women joined his group, eager to shed their old lives and dedicate themselves fully to his teachings. They began calling themselves the Vine Community, marking the roots of what would eventually become the 12 tribes. As more people joined, they started living communally, sharing all their belongings and pooling up their resources to support the group. Every aspect of life was centered on the teachings of Spriggs, who now claimed that he was divinely inspired. In addition to his charismatic leadership, Spriggs fostered a sense of exclusivity within his teachings. He framed the Vine community as this elite group of believers, uniquely chosen by God to restore humanity to a pure way of life. This exclusivity made followers feel special, as if they had a higher calling that couldn't be found in traditional society. And it's just so funny because every cult thinks this. Every single cult thinks this exact same thing. And at some point, you would start hoping that they would realize, like, okay, well, if that group thinks they're all chosen people, but so does that group over there, they all think God is speaking to that guy over there. And I understand, obviously, cults are very insular and blocked off from other belief systems. But it's just so interesting that the root of all of these cults is literally the exact same ideology, which is typically we are all special people who are following the most special leader who has a direct connection to God. And he's the only one that can speak for God. And this is the only way to reach salvation. And it's like, I think even just everyone in any other religion recognizes that there are other religions. So it's just so interesting to me that there's like, yeah, many people claim to have a special connection to God and gain a following that turns into a cult, but we are the special ones and we are not the cult and we are the real ones with true purpose. It's just a good example of cognitive dissonance, I guess. But the more followers invested in this lifestyle, the harder it became to imagine a life outside of it. As the Vine community expanded, Spriggs became more stringent with his rules and interpretations, and the community grew increasingly isolated from the outside world. The group established strict codes for modesty, dietary laws, and gender roles. To maintain purity, Spriggs mandated that members should cut off contact with their families and friends outside the community, whom he considered spiritually toxic. Yeah. We've definitely heard this one before. It's all because he's trying to exercise methods of control. It's almost like these cult leaders are all working from the same playbook. And it's like, are they aware? Do they know? I mean, Ron Hubbard knew. He knew the quickest way to get rich was to start a religion. So that's what he did. So it's just so fascinating. So by the late 1970s, Spriggs's community was thriving in its own way. And he continued to solidify his power. He claimed the group was the true Israel and that they were the first 12 tribes since the ancient days. They would be the ones to usher in the second coming of Christ. As Spriggs' teachings became more radical, he established himself as the unquestionable leader of the group, changing his name to Yonek to symbolize his prophetic role, because of course he did. His followers came to see him as an authority figure who held their salvation in his hands. By the 1980s, what had started as a simple Bible study in Chattanooga had grown into a full-fledged movement with hundreds of followers. The group rebranded itself as the 12 Tribes, formalizing Spriggs' vision of a modern-day Israel. And they continued to expand into other parts of the United States and even internationally. And over the next few decades, the 12 Tribes would create restaurants, cafes, and communal farms as extensions of their ministry, with the group's labor supporting their expansion. But behind the scenes, the group was becoming increasingly authoritarian, and it controlled every aspect of its members' lives. So this mix of community, strict religious adherence, and a sense of divine purpose kept followers dedicated. But as time went on, what had seemed to be like a spiritual utopia began to show signs of deeper, darker issues. Followers found themselves caught in a web of control, where leaving was not only discouraged, but made almost impossible. From Chattanooga, the group expanded to Vermont, New York, and other parts of the U.S., eventually spreading all the way to Europe, South America, and Australia. The group became known for its dedication to Spriggs' teachings, their close-knit community, and, of course, their isolation from mainstream society. So, what were some of the 12 Tribes' beliefs? Well, Spriggs taught that modern society was corrupt and that his followers were part of a pure community called to live according to ancient biblical principles. He believed they were literally the 12 tribes of Israel, with a divine mission to restore true worship and prepare for the end of days. Scripture was used to justify their lifestyle, communal living, and complete submission to Spriggs' authority, and of course, the suppression of individualism. So right there, just that one sentence basically breaks down the BITE model. We have behavior control, information control, thought control, and even emotional control. Because you're going to strip away and numb your emotions and your feelings when you have no sense of your own identity. So followers were encouraged to give up their worldly possessions and embrace a communal life where everything was shared, which sounds romantic and sweet, but for those longing for structure, this sense of unity and order was initially comforting, but it did not come without a price. Leaving mainstream culture meant complete separation from the outside world, including family and friends. The children were homeschooled and raised within the community to prevent corruption from outside influences, leading to an almost complete disconnection from the modern world. At the core of the 12 tribes' lifestyle was a strict interpretation of Scripture, which was manipulated by Spriggs and other leaders to enforce obedience and loyalty. The group taught that true believers were called to reject mainstream culture and embrace an authentic way of life, one that mirrored the communal living of early Christians described in the book of Acts. According to their interpretation, the only way to be spiritually pure was to renounce personal possessions, submit entirely to community authority, and adopt a collective identity under Spriggs' teachings. So Spriggs and his leaders selectively used Bible verses to shape the lifestyle that stripped members of their identities. They would cite passages like Acts 2:44-45, which speaks of the early disciples having all things in common. And the 12 tribes doctrine required every follower to give up all those belongings and place all assets and earnings into the community pool. This wasn't actually a sacrifice. This was so that Spriggs could make money being a cult leader. That is it. Members also worked within the group's businesses, such as the Yellow Deli restaurants, without pay. I repeat, they do not get paid. So if you've been to a Yellow Deli restaurant, you're supporting a cult, and those cult members are not getting paid. So, which is crazy because I have literally been to the Yellow Deli in Chattanooga before I realized it was connected to a cult. This was like years ago. And I remember being in there and the vibe, it's kind of cool. It feels like you're kind of like in a treehouse, but there's like a full mural of what looked like a biblical scene, but then there were multiple different like names for their god and different stories I'd never heard of. It was very strange. And I remember being like, this feels odd. And then in their little like store that they have like connected to the restaurant, they had all these like quote unquote local goods that I'm assuming were made on the commune. So like honey and soaps and utensils made of wood and stuff like that. It was a very, very like odd experience. And now that I've been there and I know that it's connected to a cult, I'm like, oh, now that whole restaurant makes total sense. I feel like you can just sense it, the oddity of it, because it does feel kind of strange when you go in. It just feels strange. But the employees, instead of getting pay from the restaurants, they received basic necessities like food and shelter, and anything they did earn, like any tips, they would be pooled to serve the community. And so a lot of people liked this. I think a lot of people are open to the idea of communal living. It creates that sense of unity and everyone shares a purpose. But it also meant that you're completely dependent on this group for every aspect of your life, from financial support to emotional well-being. There's no me, only we. And as your identity fades, members are expected to just conform completely to that community's standards. So within this communal lifestyle, strict submission to authority was a non-negotiable. Leaders who were appointed by Spriggs held absolute power, and questioning them was considered a rejection of God's will. Hebrews 13:17, which urges followers to, quote, obey those who rule over you, unquote, was used to justify this hierarchy. Members were taught that obedience to leadership was synonymous with obedience to God. How convenient for those leaders. Even personal decisions, from who they could marry to how they could dress, were subject to approval by community leaders or elders. Failure to comply to their rules often led to consequences in the form of public shaming or other punishment. They also were forced to look the same. So what they could wear, how they could style their hair, was all dictated to them because they had to maintain a pure and uniform appearance. Members were encouraged to look similar and act as one body, emphasizing that they were part of a holy community that was set apart from the rest of the world. In many cases, people were giving up hobbies and friendships and erasing parts of themselves to fit into this collective mold. So let's talk about these leaders or elders who were handpicked by Spriggs and wielded substantial power over followers' lives. They acted as his enforcers, ensuring that everyone in the community adhered to Spriggs' rules. They were also seen as intermediaries between Spriggs and the rest of the community, making his teachings and instructions seem even more sacred. For members, Spriggs and his elders determined everything, from how they dressed to how they worshiped to who they could marry and when they could have children. Spriggs saw relationships and marriages as tools to strengthen the community, and he would decide when people would marry. And his word was law. So followers had no say in these very personal matters. And if you are wondering, yes, marriages were arranged or approved based on what Spriggs believed would serve the community best. And he would often separate couples if he thought it was necessary. So this level of control extended into family life and child rearing as well. For children born into the 12 tribes, they were separated culturally from birth. So they were homeschooled and had no outside influence or oversight. Because the group thought that public education was a threat that would corrupt children with worldly ideas, so they designed a strict curriculum that revolved around obedience, hard work, and submission to authority. These children grew up without exposure to pop culture, media, or peers outside the community. They're totally isolated from the modern world. And parents were instructed exactly how to raise their children, with Spriggs' doctrines emphasizing strict discipline and obedience. Children were viewed as property of the community, meant to be molded into loyal followers from birth. And Spriggs required that children be disciplined harshly to ensure obedience and purity, a teaching that he justified using biblical references about disciplining the young. So this meant that any adult could discipline or abuse any child, no matter if they were a parent or not. So if any adult caught a child doing something that they deemed wrong, disrespectful, not for the community, that child would get punished. Former members have reported instances of physical punishment and described it as a painful but expected part of growing up in the group. So all this physical punishment was justified by the group's strict interpretation of biblical teachings on discipline, like Proverbs 13:24, spare the rod, spoil the child. Children were often spanked or hit with rods as a form of punishment for minor disobedience, all under the belief that this would create obedient, God-fearing adults. Former members have shared accounts of even witnessing children being punished publicly for minor infractions like failure to follow instructions or displaying signs of individuality like laughing too loudly. Laughing. It's heartbreaking to hear about. And parents were expected to enforce these disciplinary methods rigorously. Even questioning these practices was seen as a sign of weakness or lack of faith. Elders often oversaw the discipline of children, making sure parents adhered to the rules. Parents who showed compassion or hesitated in punishing their children risked being shamed for their, quote, failure to keep their families in line. This strict approach to discipline fostered a sense of fear among children, making obedience a survival mechanism rather than a real choice. So what did the children learn in school? Well, they learned basic reading and arithmetic, and they were told to memorize a lot of scripture. They basically just practiced skills that would benefit their community. So they learned how to garden, and they also learned how to work at the Yellow Deli. Yeah, good old-fashioned unpaid child labor. This isolation from the outside world and outside education ensured that these children grew up with minimal knowledge of the world beyond 12 tribes, maybe even fear it. And this rigid approach extended beyond children, but to all members who faced control over nearly every aspect of their lives. Clothing was highly regulated, with members expected to wear modest, uniform-like attire that minimized individual expression. Men were often dressed simple, while women were required to wear long skirts or dresses with their hair covered in scarves or other head coverings. The rules for the women were especially strict, as they were taught that modesty and submission were their paths to spiritual purity. Jewelry, makeup, and even wearing certain colors were discouraged to maintain what leaders deemed appropriate modesty. So there's modesty and then there's like appropriate modesty, which is way more modest, I'm assuming, or just plain old controlling. Individual expression was seen as a direct threat to the group's unity. So music, art, and literature outside of those created or approved by the 12 tribes were forbidden. Books and music from the outside world were seen as corrupting influences that could sow seeds of rebellion or individuality. Art, when allowed, had to be religious in nature or serve the purpose of glorifying the community's beliefs. This total restriction on outside culture created this vacuum where only Spriggs's teachings filled up the space, leaving room for no alternative ideas or perspectives. And gender roles within 12 tribes were rigidly defined. Men were seen as the spiritual leaders and breadwinners responsible for enforcing discipline and overseeing community duties. Women, on the other hand, you guessed it, were expected to take on subservient roles, managing the household, raising children, and supporting the men. From a young age, girls were taught to be obedient, modest, and self-sacrificing, while boys were groomed to become future leaders of the group. These roles were reinforced with the idea that deviating from them was sinful and would jeopardize their standing within the community. Even thoughts were regulated. Members were expected to avoid worldly thoughts and maintain a focus on community teachings. The elders would often question individuals, particularly children, so they're really trying to stop all critical thought from a young age. But they would ask children about their thoughts, punishing them if they didn't align with the group's teachings. Members were also encouraged to confess impure or doubtful thoughts in order to cleanse themselves, and this created an environment of self-surveillance. It also provided leaders with collateral, so if anyone even tried to leave or question the rules, their dirty laundry would be hung out to dry. Also, all personal relationships were strictly monitored. So if you had a romantic relationship, you had to get your elders' approval because the community believed that those marriages needed to support or serve the purpose of strengthening the group instead of personal happiness. And those who resisted or wanted a different relationship were shamed and punished. So the end result of these strict rules was a community where every member, from children to adults, felt an intense pressure to conform. The boundaries set around clothing, relationships, personal expression, and even thoughts created a culture of total control. The 12 tribes presented this as a pure way of life, free from the corruption of the outside world, because if you have to make a decision for yourself, that must mean you are corrupt. And especially when it came to children, they grew up knowing only the world within 12 tribes, with obedience enforced by strict rules and harsh punishments. So as they became adults, they didn't really have a choice. They had to stay on the path laid out for them because they had no education, no exposure to other ways of life, and they had no personal resources to support themselves outside of the group if they did want to escape. But controlling every facet of life created a self-sustaining cycle where each generation within the cult was raised with those same teachings. So it started to seem normal to them. Now, of course, the matter of finances always comes up in cults, and Spriggs regulated that as well. He made sure that they had no personal assets or income. Members were expected to hand over all of their earnings, which would then be redistributed by the community, but probably mostly Spriggs hung on to a big chunk of change, I would imagine. So this meant that followers were also financially dependent on the group. So not just education-wise, connection-wise, emotionally, they're financially dependent on the group. So how would they leave? How would someone born in this group leave or even come up with the idea to get out? Even if a member wanted to leave, they didn't have any money, no savings, no possessions. Everything they owned was considered community property. So what are they to do? Plus, Spriggs painted the outside world as evil and dangerous. This practice was known as doctrinal separation, and it taught members that mainstream society was corrupt and that only fully separating themselves from it could they remain spiritually clean. And family members who weren't in the group, they were labeled as unbelievers and then, therefore, unworthy of contact. So they were cutting off their ties with parents, siblings, friends when they joined the group. Contact with outsiders was only permissible when absolutely necessary, and it was meant to be totally limited. Members were conditioned to believe that any doubts were signs of weakness or a lack of faith. Over the years, this led to a powerful psychological dependence on the group, as members found themselves unable to even imagine a life outside. And for those who did leave, the journey back to the, quote, real world, unquote, was jarring. Most had no work experience outside of 12 tribes' businesses. They didn't have education beyond the group's curriculum, and they had very few connections with people outside. Some had to try to rebuild relationships with family members that they hadn't spoken to in years, while others had a really hard time learning basic social and professional skills because they were never taught them in the community. One former member explained that she initially found the lifestyle refreshing and a return to simplicity. But over time, she grew exhausted from the never-ending work shifts and the constant demand to put the community above her own well-being. She felt trapped, unable to leave without the resources to start a new life. And others have pointed out that the emphasis on work wasn't just about supporting the community financially, but also a means of preventing followers from questioning or challenging the group's doctrine. Members were kept so busy that they had little time to think independently or consider alternatives. And exhaustion from working at the delis or their coffee shops and totally being forced to look at yourself in a critical way and observe all the other cult members, it just became exhausting. Members' mental and physical energy was spent on the community rather than questioning the community. And what's interesting about this is The law did try to get involved at some point when it came to the 12 tribes' businesses because they were operated with very minimal transparency. Customers, like myself, often had no idea about the group's labor practices or the cult's beliefs, or had any idea that the Yellow Deli or Common Grounds Cafe was connected to a cult. So, for instance, when authorities investigated claims of labor violations and unpaid wages, community leaders argued that all labor was voluntary and that members chose to work without pay as part of their spiritual commitment. But former members and labor rights experts and activists saw this as exploitation, given that most followers didn't have the option to say no without facing backlash or public punishment from the community leaders. For those who managed to leave, the years spent working at the Yellow Deli often left them without any real marketable skills in the outside world. They struggled to find jobs because they had no formal job history or even savings or references because they're probably ostracized from the cult at that point. Without any financial assets, many former members faced homelessness and poverty upon leaving. So, over time, the followers became a lot more dependent, and Spriggs decided to take further steps to ensure their total loyalty. In the end, the 12 tribes' promise of family, purpose, and salvation was also a trap. What started as a sincere search for meaning and belonging transformed into a life of submission and obedience, where even thoughts of independence were seen as signs of disobedience. For many, it was only years after living in this system that they fully understood the depth of control that they were under. The community they had once seen as a sanctuary had become a place where they felt trapped, bound by fear, guilt, and the loss of personal freedom. The community they had once seen as a sanctuary had become a place where they felt trapped, bound by fear, guilt, and the loss of personal freedom. For those who spent years, sometimes their entire lives within the 12 tribes, leaving was one of the hardest choices they would ever have to make. The process of escaping, because it's not just leaving at this point, it's escaping, was not just physically demanding. It also meant walking away from the only world they had known, with very little in terms of possessions, financial resources, or even basic knowledge about how to survive in the outside world. Many members who left did so with only the clothes on their backs, completely unprepared for life beyond the community. Escape often required secrecy, as members who expressed a desire to leave would typically face pressure to stay. Leaders would attempt to convince doubters that they were abandoning their, quote, spiritual family, unquote, and turning away from God. And those who persisted risked being publicly shamed or even ostracized. This pressure created an atmosphere where leaving felt not only risky, but shameful, as if the act of seeking independence was a betrayal of everything they had been taught to value. Many former members described the overwhelming fear, confusion, and even guilt they felt upon leaving. For some, the outside world felt like a completely foreign landscape. Years of isolation and indoctrination had taught them that mainstream society was dangerous and morally corrupt, making it even more difficult to trust others or even seek help. Even simple tasks like finding food, shelter, or employment, which honestly isn't so easy anymore. I've been on a job hunt for like 6 months now. But finding employment and these basic necessities for them was unfamiliar and intimidating, especially for those who had grown up entirely within 12 tribes, who were born into the cult. So they had no experience with navigating daily life on the outside. For those who managed to reach family members after leaving, reconnecting was often another emotional challenge. Many former members had cut off contact with their families for years, as instructed by the 12 tribes' teachings. Reestablishing those bonds could be awkward or painful, especially when family members had been deeply hurt by years of separation. Former members described struggling with shame, feeling like they had betrayed or abandoned their loved ones. The psychological scars left by life in the 12 tribes were profound. Former members often felt a complex mix of guilt and shame, not only for leaving the group, but also for the years they had spent adhering to their teachings. Many had to come to terms with the fact that they had raised their children within the group's strict roles or played a role in enforcing those rules and sometimes abuses onto others. So therapy became a crucial part of healing for many as they worked to unpack the years of emotional manipulation and control they had experienced. For some, the journey to healing involved years of therapy to address symptoms like PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Former members frequently report symptoms associated with PTSD, including flashbacks, nightmares, and a heightened sense of fear or vigilance, even after leaving. But therapy also served as a tool for rebuilding self-worth and independence, as many survivors struggled with deep-seated fears of inadequacy or guilt ingrained in them during their time in the 12 tribes. Online survivor groups have also been very helpful, especially when it came to advocacy for other people to get out. It created a safe space where ex-members could share their stories, find validation, and rebuild their identities outside the confines of the cult. For many, these communities provided the support they'd been denied within the group, helping them to understand that their feelings of shame and guilt and confusion were all common and part of the healing process. Relearning everyday life was like learning a new language. From figuring out how to handle money to understanding social norms, former members found themselves overwhelmed by the freedom because they'd never experienced it before. Many described feeling lost, as though they didn't know who they were outside of the cult. So they have these identity issues, feeling torn between the person they'd been in the group and the person they wanted to become in the outside world. Leaving the 12 tribes was often a leap into the unknown, filled with obstacles that most people take for granted. The fear, shame, and confusion left lasting marks. But for those who found the courage to leave, the journey toward healing and rebuilding their lives became a testament to resilience and the enduring human spirit. In their stories, we see not just the tragedy of life within the 12 tribes, but the hope and strength of those who, despite the odds, found their way back to freedom. So where does this cult stand today? Well, it's still around and its businesses are still operable. There are still people living in these communities who are totally isolated from the outside world and have no resources to get out. It makes me want to create some kind of like crowdfunding or something as like a resource to help people in these cults get out, to provide some kind of financial stability so people don't feel so trapped. But it's very important that we recognize these businesses, we avoid these businesses, and if we do decide to financially support the businesses, it could be helpful to just ask some critical thinking questions. Just ask about the art you see on the wall or what this religion is. Ask them questions about communal living if it comes up. Never say, I think you're in a cult. Obviously, that'll never get someone out of a cult. But I think there is a productive way to just start asking people questions that spark more critical thinking within them. Because you never know, asking the right question could literally save someone's life. Anyways, what do you think about 12 tribes, guys? I feel like there's a lot more we could unpack with this one, especially since there are still those fringe groups all over the country/world. So I might dive a little bit deeper into this group. Let me know if that's something you would find interesting. And if you got to the end, comment a yellow heart for Yellow Deli. Ugh. It's so crazy too, because like I remember going to this restaurant with two friends who are very, very Christian and them being like, wow, this is lovely. And me being like, this is weird because it doesn't seem like quote unquote real Christianity, because this is a really weird interpretation of this story that I'm familiar with from the Bible. So I mean, let me know if you've had an experience at one of these locations at a Yellow Deli or a coffee shop or anything owned by 12 tribes. And just, I would not support those businesses. Or if you do support the business, make sure you're asking those leading questions that can help someone, think a little more critically. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for your support. I really, really appreciate you. I think I'm going to be checking in on Jeff and Shalia of Twin Flames Universe very soon. So stay tuned for that video. I really, really appreciate your support, and please have a great rest of your week. Stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. Until next time, bye.